Paula is an artist, art writer, and curator. She heads the Department of Printmaking at Rabindra Bhavan and is a trekker and traveler in her spare time. Puneet is an artist, curator, product designer, and collector of tribal arts and textiles. He is on the board of directors of the craft of Daskar and has worked closely with craft persons across India for over 2 decades. I would like to now ask I also would like you to know that we would welcome your comments and questions at the end of the conversation, and which surely we would like to answer if we have the time. My first question to you and Paula, Puneet, both of you tell us as what led you to textiles? How did you both get interested in textiles? Puneet, if you tell us first.
Oh, okay. So, hi everybody. Thank you for being online. So my practice is in many ways derived from the very painstaking and meticulous process of how a textile comes into life. And I started my journey in textiles when I was a kid. And as a kid, we would have a lot of festivals and functions, and we would dress up gods and goddesses with, little fabrics and little laces and stuff like that. We would join them together and do. Also, with the background of Renu Modi just now, we've got oleographs of Raja Ravi Verma, that have influenced me while I was growing, calendar art. And we would dress these clothes and with the deities and all with these clothes, for Janmashtami, Durga Puja, and all these occasions. For me, my mother has been a big influence because she used to do a lot of tatting all the time, and that was one of my earlier exposures to fabrics, threads, yarns, and all in my early stage. The big switchover that happened for me was when I went to the States, and I renewed respect for these handmade textiles and crafts because I'd seen a lot of it, and having worked with artisans and craftsmen for over a period of 15, 20 years, this has given me a major opportunity to work and experience the lives of these artisans and craftsmen and the whole process that they go through, and to understand the way they develop products and their livelihoods. And that's how the whole history of the art itself or the craft itself becomes a part of the collective for me too, other than just the product that I take. So that's how it is. Paula, to you.
Now over to you, Paula.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Renu, for starting this initiative. Very happy to be here. Hi, Puneet, and hello to everyone who's online with us today. To answer Renu's question, the interest in textile goes back almost to my childhood. My mother and my grandmother were my initiation into exposure to the crafts and textiles of India. My mother was an expert seamstress, and that's how my interest in textiles, embroidery, crafts, various things.
Paula, could you speak a little louder?
Sure. That's how all of this came about. I went on afterwards to do a master's and a PhD at Kalabhavan in Shantiniketan. And the years that I spent there were crucial to my understanding of craft and textile practices, artisanal practices. The reason being that unlike the British academic system of education that we have in our schools across India, Shantiniketan has a different system of education where a more holistic approach to the arts is seen, and vernacular practices, indigenous practices, these are considered valid languages of art making. Even though I may not have specifically used these languages to make art during that time, nevertheless, I had an exposure to all of this, and I continue to practice it alongside my core practice of printmaking. The time that the use of textiles, garments, fashion, all of this really crystallized for me and made its way into my practice were the 5 years that I taught at the National Institute of Fashion Technology in Kolkata from 1999 to 2004. I originally joined to teach art appreciation, but I went on to teach history of costume. And my other great love is art history, and but everything that I had always studied in art history, I had to reorient my passion. And it was the first time that I started to understand not just the aesthetics, but also the politics of textile, of fashion. And I started to look at these as social and cultural signifiers. I also started to understand the the power of textile and fashion, its transformative power on the body. And this is the time that it actually started to make its way into my practice, and I seriously started using textile as a material and textile processes as part of my processes of making.
Thank you. Does gender play a role here? Isn't textiles, clothes, fashion, embroidery considered a women's domain? Puneet, you must have been asked many times this question as well. How come you are there?
Yes. I have been asked a number of times this question. People who've seen my work before and then have met me or have come to know who the artist is has said, oh, we always thought it would probably be a girl or a female artist because of the very fact of embroidery and crochet. And it is frustrating, like really frustrating for me at many levels, because coming to a place of, to be in this 21st century and to be there. So with all due respect to the feminist movement and everything, the whole idea of art cannot be just based on, art can't be gender based. You can't just kind of say something like that randomly. So that kind of drives me a little frustratingly, kind of, it disturbs me a lot, yeah. And it came very naturally to me because I saw my grandmother, my mother, and then I have a wife who's a textile designer. I've seen everyone working. So at home, at every front, any occasion, India is fortunate to have so many festivals and occasions. We're always, ready to party and dress up. And also with all those opportunities, it's kind of weird. But yeah, coming to the point that people do say this, yes, they do. And a lot of well-known weavers, craftsmen, cooks, fashion designers have been men. A simple rafugar person is a person who's normally a guy who does this. So point being, the challenge is to create and develop something and not really define it. So that's something that I personally feel, and it kind of drives me to the point where you see a lot of weavers, craftsmen working, and a lot of it comes with the whole fact of such a natural way they do it. So gender really, I don't know, fits in at which level, because at some level, when it comes to textile or textile art, I would say bringing that element kind of doesn't work for me in this century. Definitely a few years back, I would say yes.
But like when you talk of gender is actually an issue which is there in contemporary art. When you look at, the domain is all basically men, as you mentioned, rafukars, even designers and karigars and all are men. Most of them are men. But somehow when it comes to contemporary art, then the gender issue comes. I don't know what Paula thinks about it.
We have had Meera Mukherjee, we've had Arpita Singh. So, we have all, at every level, we've had artists who've done work. So, yes, there are. But, Paula, do you want to say anything to this?
So, I personally feel, while I don't think that, in terms of adopting the use of textile or textile practices or textile as a material for art making, sort of peculiar to a particular gender, or that it is necessarily a women's domain. Because, across India, as Puneet correctly said, a lot of traditional craftspersons who are involved, or artists who are involved in the making of textiles, are male. Of course, there are aspects of making textiles in which, on a larger scale, in which women are involved. But a lot of the work is actually done by men. But on a smaller scale, in the domestic sphere, particularly in more privileged societies, the textile arts has traditionally become a women's domain. It has been a women's domain. And, to some extent, to learn to sew, to learn to embroider, these are you sort of fill certain roles that are attributed to your gender. So, for example, I learned to sew. I learned to embroider from my mother. But my brother, who was my only other sibling, he was never expected to learn how to sew. Right. So, so these are, these are sort of traditional constructs in which, many of us have been reared. Having said this, when I, as an artist, laid claim to the use of textile practices in my work, or I laid claim to textile as a material, definitely was very conscious of the fact that I was laying claim to a woman's domain. I was very conscious of the fact that I was laying claim to a legacy that I had inherited from my grandmother and my mother. And it was a very conscious decision to claim that legacy, because I personally felt that that the sewing that they did, my mother and my grandmother both made nokshikatha, and I felt that that was a valid art making language, and therefore I laid claim to it as a valid language. And I will definitely say, I mean, my work has often been read as feminist. I personally don't necessarily work from a feminist position, but I would definitely say that my response comes from a feminine standpoint. So in that respect, I would say that my work is gendered for certain. My response to material, my application of the medium, my understanding of the politics that surround the history and the position of the textile arts, all of this is a gendered response for sure.
I know that both of you collect textiles. Could you briefly speak about your collections and how different textiles have influenced your work in different ways? Puneet?
Okay. Well, I've traveled and enjoyed most of my countries that I really like and enjoy them actually. So there have been places like Egypt, Istanbul, Greece, Baja California, and Mexico. And it's all because when I was going to the States, we would have these transit flights and we would stop over without really paying much. And that kind of just made me see a lot more than I would have probably seen. So, so that impressed me a lot, of picking up small little pieces and stuff like that. But having said that, any place I go, be it India or abroad, I really believe in the fact of picking an artwork, either it is a folk or a tribal art form, a textile, music, utensils. It could be copper, terracotta, some kind of material. So I try and pick up one element of something, because that kind of makes far more interest to me, and it builds up an entire story or a narrative for me. The aesthetics of a social, economical, cultural connection that are determined by the adaptability of a craft by its very surroundings or boundaries fascinates me a lot. So that also derives, like the very fact that sometimes a craft develops better, or an art form is developed more so in an area because that was the need or the utility of that specific area more than anything else. Sometimes it's because of the fact that this material is available in that space. So because the material is available, it starts, refining itself in, or technically some craft is involved to develop it into making something more. So that's one of the ways I see things moving towards for me. And yeah, I collect a lot of religious icons and scripts and all. I like to pick up a lot of textiles, woven, embellished. I don't know if you can see, but there is one Istanbul piece, Uzbekistan, sorry, that in the background, and jewelry. I love terracotta and silver utensils and artifacts. So that's how I see it. There's no set pattern, but yeah, these are few things that I like to cover, so that I kind of cover the entire paraphernalia of whatever is there in that space.
Paula, could you let us also enlighten us with your textile collection?
So like Puneet, I'm an avid traveler. And in fact, it was on one such travel that Puneet and I met and became friends. We didn't buy any textiles.
And we went to a place that was textiles. So.
Yes, we did.
Which one was it? You didn't tell me.
Where was it that we went?
Who is it? Alua, right? No,
yeah.
I think so.
Anyway.
And at this point, I must let everybody know, Paula is a very good cook. So she cooked for us.
We also went to a utensils museum where we saw the museum. It was fascinating. It was in Ahmedabad. And we ate a lot of food. Both Puneet and I are great foodies. So a lot of my collecting actually comes out of my travels. And I travel extensively across South Asia and Southeast Asia, widely in the Indian subcontinent. My husband is a trekker, so I trek with him once in a way, maybe once a year if I can manage it. And as a result of this, I've traveled widely in the Himalayas and the Trans-Himalayas. And I'm a collector of narratives primarily. I like meeting people. I like collecting stories. And these stories often lead me to collecting objects. And these objects can be just really simple things like, kitchen, utensils or some such thing, or they can be, textile, very, very evolved textiles and other such things once in a way. As far as crafts go, I'm not a particularly informed collector. I collect whatever takes my fancy. But with textiles, I tend to be more discerning in what I collect. So a large part of what I collect is from the Himalayan belt and the Trans-Himalayas, from Ladakh, from Spiti, from Zanskar, and in places in Nepal, in wonderful places like Mustang, which are on the border with Tibet, Bhutan, Sikkim, just so many places in that, in the entire mountainous region. I also travel a lot in Southeast Asia, and some of my most precious textiles actually come from countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and what actually interests me in addition to the aesthetics of the actual object itself is the migratory nature of textiles. And, following that thread of as to how these textiles have migrated across, it's interesting. I mean, Renu, you were with us in Varanasi when we went, textile viewing, so to speak.
That was so beautiful.
Yeah, and it was fascinating to see, if you remember one of the places that we went to, Tibet, that Chinese brocade has for centuries been woven in Varanasi. It was a complete revelation to discover that.
Even the brocade that's done around the tankhas is all done there. So
yes, yes. So the traveling, the nature of textiles across this entire Southeast Asia belt is really interesting. I find that narrative is almost addictive to follow, actually, and that spurs my interest to quite an extent. And of course, I collect exhaustively across India, wherever and whenever I travel, and there are just vast wealth of textiles that India has. I have a huge collection of all of that, and so.
I'll never forget the scroll which you had given us for our drawing show. A long scroll with 16 feet. In fact, Nilima Sheikh and Mrinalini Mukherjee both came. Both of them had come to see it again to look at that beautiful stitched scroll which you had given us.
Hugely influenced by the Tibetan, by the Tibetan tanka, the Buddhist tankas, and
yes.
You see one in the corner at the back there in red.
It's too small, I think we can't see it so clearly.
So I do have a collection of tankas which are from the Himalayan regions, and yeah, that was inspired by from the tankas.
My next question to both of you, though there have been very few artists such as Mrinalini Mukherjee, who worked with hem. For both of you, it must have been like breaking new grounds when you began using them in your contemporary art practice. What sparked this understanding and appreciation of craft as a valid language of contemporary art? How would you kind of place yourselves or your work using this?
Like Paula said, we've in India, we are spoiled because every kilometer that you go past, the language changes, the craft changes, people change, the food changes, everything changes. So we living in India have been totally spoiled, and we've been very lucky to kind of live here and experience. So that itself kind of builds up, and India with such diverse geographically kind of, climate and everything, we've got fibers like banana, yarn, wool, bamboo, walnut, and just name it. We've got silk. So that itself is very interesting. Also, the very use historically in the Buddhist scripts, the palm leaf scripts, or inscriptions done on bamboo have been very clearly a form of art or craft that has been there and has worked. So that has always been something of interest for me personally. When we talk of textiles, some of my favorite would be more than just the visual look of the textile. It's the process of the technique that puts it together to its aesthetics and builds it up. So sometimes it's also the process that is so meditative and long and beautiful, that just does it. So Ikkat, for example, Bandni, Bandage, Ajrak, Kantha, all these are, places where simple, and you see that in my work, you'll see a lot of, even if nothing else, I would do drawings with little marks of Kantha or patterns that are repetitive, and it could be, you could call them Mughal Jalis or call them patterns or things from Banarsis that worked for me. One of the things that I love is because the yarn is first dyed and then woven. The artisan itself kind of, the weaver has to very meticulously, almost like a mathematical precision, has to work and weave and dye each yarn and kind of weave it through to kind of get to the final piece of what it is. And well, this could be a separate conversation altogether because there is way too much to speak on each craft.
I think we're running short of time also, and can I ask Paula to comment on this question as what you feel?
It's interesting that Puneet refers to the meditative nature of the textile arts, because this is one of the things that deeply draws me also to a lot of the textile arts. One of the practices that I find extremely meditative is embroidery, which I use a lot in my work. And because I'm fundamentally a printmaker and etching is the medium that I primarily use, and even when I, of course, there are 100 ways of making an etching, but I tend to be a line etcher. I work a lot with line, and so the act of drawing on the metal plate with a needle point is a very meticulous and a very meditative, solitary process. One of the things that drew me to embroidery is the same meditative nature. And Katha, which Puneet refers to, is something that I've worked with also, which I also exhaustively work with. And what actually drew me to it is my discovery of the Nokshi Kantha, which I had seen my mother and my grandmother doing, but I really understood the Nokshi Kantha when I visited Bangladesh, and I really saw Nokshi Kanthas in their full glory for the first time. The interesting thing about Nokshi Kantha is that it is two-sided; it works both ways. And what is very interesting is that a lot of Nokshi Kanthas are actually running narratives. They're not repeat patterns. They're running narratives. And so I realized that it was actually a storytelling medium. And I'm just going to show you a sari that I don't know how much of it you can see on the screen, but this.
I've never seen.
So
beautiful.
So this is something that I embroidered myself when I was a postgraduate student in Shantini. At that time, I cannot say that I did this very consciously or that I understood what I was doing, but I was using Katha as a drawing tool, the needle and thread as a drawing tool, even that far back. And this is something that I sort of brought back to my work, where when I learned to stitch, for example, as a young girl, this used to frustrate my mother because I would not embroider on a premeditated pattern. I would insist on embroidering randomly.
Art is doing.
But now what I do is I draw with the needle and thread. For me, that's the drawing tool. And, and Katha is a medium that makes that possible. So, so these are the sort of things that attract me. I'm also deeply drawn to chintz as a textile. Its antecedents in, kalamkari, in ajrak, all of that, the politics of chintz, which, are so connected with the whole process of cultural colonization. So that whole history interests me deeply, and chintz is something that, has been with me a long time. It doesn't go away. I'm currently in the process of making my own chintz. I'm drawing towards it currently. So, so these are the ways in which I think we absorb these processes, but it comes of deep interactions with the textiles, with the makers of the textiles, with the craftspersons, understandings of the process, the philosophy, the environment, the communities that make them. You know, there's a long investment that I'm sure both Puneet and I have in exploring, researching, and understanding the philosophy of these textiles. It's not just, you know, the surface.
The last question, quick question, because I'm seeing a number of comments coming in from Vasco especially. A lot of contemporary artists like Shobha Bruta, Gopika Nath, Smriti Dixit, and many more are working with fibers and textiles these days. You know, I've always felt that, but do you feel textile is yet to be accepted as a mainstream art practice? I mean, this is my last question to both of you, because it always comes into my mind when I show your work. Paula?
Paula?
Want me to start? Renu, I would say that it's a process, it's a journey. You know, starting from artists like Jamini Roy being a first to, you know, Meera Mukherjee, you know, all, you know, these artists who appropriate craft processes, to someone like Mrinalini Mukherjee, who in the modernist era was a woman sculptor working in a soft material like hemp, making soft sculptures. And even the content of her work is very, very gendered. It is not just the material and the process, but the content is also very gendered. And it is a fact that in her day and age, she did not find the recognition that
I agree with you.
was that should have been her due, and it has taken time coming. Today, Mrinalini is a widely recognized artist.
I agree with you.
So it is a process, it's a journey that we are all part of. Today, there are more and more artists appropriating textile practices, textile arts. I myself was part of a beautiful exhibition at the Bhavda Jilad Museum, where you know, which was only on textile practice, and there were at least a dozen artists there, all working either with textile as a material or the politics of textile, or you know, just so many other things.
Nilima Sheikh has done a lot of work in.
Yes, yes. She too was part of that exhibition.
Yes, I know that.
So, you know, it's a process. I personally feel that like printmaking, it needs, it's a niche practice, and it needs specific focus. It needs dedicated platforms to show it. And it needs also dedicated clientele if there is to be created for it. It also needs writing around it. And, you know, there has been writing. I mean, even say a magazine like Art India has brought out an issue specifically on textiles. So it's a process. We are part of that process.
True.
I'm so glad you say that.
It is, but I also would say at the same time, the audience need to be a little more, our buyers, our galleries have also to go kind of accept the fact that this is another medium that has been, needs to be explored and has to be used. Because we've had tapestries, we've had rugs, we've had carpets, we've had torans, we've put a lot of things that have already been there. It's not been given the platform. So that's where, yeah. We've had Hussein do toys, you know, that he was inspired by carpentry work and craftsmen and all. So we've had all of those things happen. Like she said, Meera Mukherjee was for her Bastar and all, Kantha, Bastar. So today Arpita saying, for example, a lot of Kantha is her inspiration. So that all kind of falls in place. It's just that the viewer or the buyer needs to be more like
aware of it. The more awareness has to start. I think I feel is that we gallerists also need to be more aware of it. I was aware of it, and I have been showing you people for now number of so many years. So that's why I thought of this conversation, that, you know, it's very important for us to share this with the world. I'm sorry, I have to kind of, because there are people waiting and we have already overshot the time. Thank you so much, both of you, for this very exciting, informative, interesting conversation. The insights that both of you shared about the role of gender, especially, what we talked about, it was such an important issue. And I think we can continue talking about it, and it's a very long conversation, and in this very short time, I think we've spoken quite a lot. And we really hope, Paula, as what you said, that in the future, this whole process, this journey of textiles in contemporary art continues, and there would be, I'm sure, dedicated institutions. We need writings and exhibitions more and more. And I think large-scale exhibitions on this subject would be great, like what I did in drawing, when I did drawing 94, sculpture 95, print 96, all these did move the market, the awareness in the art world. So thank you all very much. And I would request all, and I hope all the people who are attending our webinar, our conversation, have enjoyed listening to us. And any questions and comments are most welcome. Paula.
We have a question from Vasvo. Hi, Vasvo. His question is, with a wide variety of materials used in contemporary fabric art, metals, paper, beads, found objects, can a line be drawn between fabric art and mixed media?
Both of you.
I'll let you take that question.
Well, I would say, Vasu, fabric, thanks for being online, first of all. And I can see a lot of people, so I'll just say thanks to everybody, Shikha, Rama, everybody, Cookie, I can see everybody here. So having said that, yeah, so a textile piece can be a mixed media fabric, because when you do dabka, when you do different kind of, you use metal beads and stuff like that, embellishments. So the very fact that a textile fabric is embellished with what kind of can take it to that level. If it's a purely woven piece, I probably would imagine it would be purely a textile, art or a form. Here, with the moment you add mediums to it, it could still be textile with mixed media as a description. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Questions, Paula, you were going to ask any comments?
I don't have any more questions here. Gargi says there are lots of compliments for my sari. Thank you, everyone.
And also, I think we have in the audience, we have one viewer who's come in. I saw briefly that she is tuning in from the States, from a different time zone. I thank you so much, Ms. Rao, to be here and to come all the way to listen to us.
Anjali saying thank you.
Oh, Anjali is there? Thank you, Anjali, for coming on board. Wonderful. How are you doing?
I think Nandini is with us too.
Nandini Chirima?
From New York. Hi, Nandini.
I'm so happy with the
questions.
No comment, no questions to answer anymore.
No.
Thank you.
From Helen Frederick to all, I'm delighted to be with you all. Thank you, Helen.
Helen is the creator of the Kala Chaupal. We work together in Jaipur.
So we've had some very interesting people on board, and I think now we have to end it, and we hope to do the next conversation of Espace Conversation next month, middle of the month. Bye-bye, all of you. So happy to have all of you on board. Bye, Puneet, and bye, Paula. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Renu. Wonderful. I'm glad we made a start with Espace Conversations.
Yes.